So welcome to Sustainability 102, the next steps. This is continuation on from the Sustainability 101 talk that I did on Monday. I'm David Chapman, Sustainability Champion here at the University of Warwick. Today we're going to be covering some of the steps that go beyond the normal, maybe day-to-day things that you think about. So things like putting the lid on a pan and make sure your kitchen doors shut, and reducing printers and switching lights off, things like that. So going on to some of the next steps that you might want to think about if you've already got that either already embedded in your behavior or you're doing that at the moment. Um, Obviously focusing on the positives of the actions that you can take as individuals. I'll just mention as well a little bit of the background at the beginning, and then we'll move on to what you can do and the Q&A. I will mention now that this is by no means a definitive list of all things you can do. Some things will be within your power as an individual to do, some things won't, and I'll try and highlight those as we go through. Obviously, everybody's different and has a slightly different journey with what they can control, but a lot of these are things that people can do. So some of the background. Apologise for those that were in on Monday's meeting, showing they'll have seen some of this already, but basically the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has said that we need to keep the global temperature below 1.5 degrees to reduce the impacts of climate change. Beyond that, we're likely to see feedback loops and a speeding up of climate change effects. We're currently at 1.1 degrees, and we're actually on target potentially for 3 to 4 by the end of this century. It's estimated that we've only got between 3 and 10 years to keep this limit to 1.5 degrees, and at the moment the Paris Agreement puts us at 2 degrees. That 1.5 degrees also gives us as humanity a 50-50 chance, and unfortunately we are currently in a 6th mass extinction level event, but we do have time still to turn this around and prevent that from happening. The UK government's declared a climate emergency in May 2019 and set targets for net zero carbon emissions by 2050. And we've also got COP26 in Glasgow in November this year. As you may remember, COP21 is the Paris Agreement. So looking at Coventry and Warwickshire, what does the temperature rising mean locally? Well, 1.5 degrees, we've got an increased amount of more erratic rainfalls leading to increased flooding, and that's impacting water availability. Economic impact from more frequent severe weather events, and globally, the economic impact is into the trillions now. Increased drought threatening food security and water supply again. Hotter temperatures increase heat-related illnesses and deaths, and also increased air pollution levels impacting on health, presenting threats as well. And beyond 1.5 at 2 degrees, all these effects from 1.5 will be amplified, but the risk of runaway impacts is again amplified. As I mentioned, we're already on track for a temperature increase of 3 to 4 degrees by the end of this century. And if we exceed 6 degrees, it's basically unlikely that runaway effects can be avoided, such the future habitability of the planet can be maintained. So this is what London is likely to look like, about 4 degrees due to sea level rise, extra flooding. Basically, we'll have a lot of climate migrants coming north. We've also already seen a lot of coastal erosion around the UK, which will cause more people to come further inland. And our new coastline will be Oxford. Now in Coventry, between 2006 and 2016, as you can see, we didn't see a lot of reduction overall in our Scope 1 and 2 emissions for Coventry. And I don't have the stats for the next few years at the moment, but I don't think it's changed by that much. So we have a lot of work to do as a city and as a region as well. And we've also got the UN Sustainable Development Goals to achieve by 2030 as well. So these are 17 goals, 169 targets, and some of the goals are, yes, government level objectives. Many of them are objectives that we can do on an individual or organization level. So I've mentioned scopes already, so I thought I'd hop into some of the jargon just to briefly outline this. And I'm going to try and avoid jargon for as much of this as possible, but I thought it would be useful to you if I just explain this a little bit. So zero carbon emissions is basically where we're not emitting any greenhouse gases at all. Net carbon or net neutral emissions are basically where you can emit a little bit of carbon emission, but then you also sequester it as well. So you balance the books to a zero. So you got a bit of red and a bit of black on your ledger, and yeah, getting to neutral. Carbon negative is actually where you sequester more carbon than you either don't emit or emit, and you're actually actually reducing the amount of emissions overall. And then scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions are the different sorts of emitters, essentially. So scope 1 emissions, and I'll take the University of Warwick as an example here. We burn natural gas to produce electricity on campus, so we produce about 60% of our own energy through that burning, and we also produce heat as a byproduct, which heats the district heating system for many of our buildings and hot water. But it's the burning of that gas that is our scope 1 emission. Scope 2 emissions are emissions that happen because we've got laptops or computers turned on, we've got lights on in the university's factories, we've got various engineering and labs and things. So it's that use of the energy. And then scope 3 is anything that happens because a business exists. So again, for the university, we have the council collecting our waste, we've got people delivering goods and services onto campus, we've got staff and students commuting, and they do that because we exist. So that's the scope, that's any emissions that are coming from them are our scope 3 emissions. But we are all in this together, and the UK Committee on Climate Change report that the majority of actions to reduce carbon emissions are through behaviour changes and societal changes, so 62%. I'm aware that recently there's been a lot of talk about the technology, and Bill Gates has done his book looking at the technologies, and technology will not do all the work that we need to. And as I said, a lot of it actually needs to come from us individually, from just reducing what we use. So what are the top 4 carbon emitting industries? We've got the energy sector, transport, agriculture and food, and clothing and fashion. Now there's third and fourth on that list might come as a shock to some. But if you think about all these systems in places and all the resources they use, it soon becomes really apparent as to why those are the top 4. I just thought I'd give you the overall view there. So first we're going to ask, where is your money? Where are you investing your money? So first is, we'll go with pensions. A lot of pensions around the world do currently fund the fossil fuel industry. They invest into it. They also invest into unethical industries such as tobacco, arms, gambling, various other industries. Fossil fuels are no longer a safe bet. In the next few years, there's a lot of evidence to show that we will see a mass switch from fossil fuels to renewables, because that's the way we need to go. And a lot of countries are starting to ditch fossil fuels generally. The fossil fuel side of things now are being used more for petrochemicals, so things like plastics. And this is something else that we need to tackle, is reduce our reliance on especially single-use plastics. And then obviously if all these sectors continue and are supported by the funding and have the effect on the planet that they're currently having, then what's the point in having a pension? Because you potentially won't have a chance to enjoy it. And you can see a picture on the right hand side of a couple who now we got a pension. Where do we fancy going? Everywhere's flooded, places on fire, got storms, got chaos. So one thing we can do is divest and move money into an ethical fund, which means it can support other sectors such as healthcare or companies aiding the transition to a low carbon economy. And you can either do this yourself with your own pension, depending on how you got it set up, or you can demand that the company you work for move it. Your pension, you can demand that your pension divest, and there is a large divestment campaign at the moment across the West Midlands, and many universities and other groups are being requested to divest from these companies. But I do, as it says at the bottom there, fully recommend that you do speak to a financial expert about this. So one of the other places that we put our money is into banks, and we need to start thinking more about ethical banking. A lot of banks have been found to be looking the other way when people do some money laundering. We've also got banks, and these are recent in the last few years examples, by the way. I haven't stated which bank it is, but you can very easily Google these. Have opened accounts just so they can charge people fees. Investing in projects such as the Dakota Pipeline and other fossil fuel projects, tax avoidance, dodgy investments, investing in industries with human rights abuse. So yes, fully recommend looking at the bank you have and maybe using that website to look at switching. The other side of this as well is mortgages. So obviously you're investing money in the bank through your savings maybe, but you've also potentially got a mortgage with a bank, and it's a case of questioning that bank. So having a quick look yesterday just to make sure these were up to date. These are 7 of the best UK banks based on ethics at the moment. And then 14 of the worst UK banks based on ethics at the moment. Obviously, there are lesser evils, but certainly worth looking into. The other question we need to be asking us is where we're spending our money as well, because in essence, you vote with your money. If you are shopping with, say, certain clothing brands and they have not got good reputations for how they look after their people, where they're getting their resources from, things like that, then we need to really look at shifting where we're spending the money. Because if we start just spending money where people are doing the right things and also socially investing and things like that, all the ones that aren't doing the correct thing will go, oh, that's where the money is. We need to follow the money. So that doesn't just account for clothing, it accounts for just about everything. So we really need to think about where we're spending our money and who it's going to and what on. So moving on to your home, and I'm aware that not everybody owns their property. Some people just rent, so we'll cover that a little bit here as well. But one of the things that most of us can do is look at our energy tariffs and use websites like uswitch.com to move to 100% renewable and carbon neutral tariffs. This helps support the green fuel industry. Now, I know that anybody is after this is probably going to immediately question, well, what about the rest of the grid? Like the overall grid is decarbonising. It is, yes. There is quite a high percentage of electric, of green energy already in the system. But to my mind, it's great to support those who are doing more electric or more renewables, and really help that make sure those industries have the money to be able to push forward. Also, with the electricity grid decarbonising, potentially it's worth for those that were looking at a new heating system or something to switch to one running off electricity rather than gas. I fully recommend, again, talking to a retrofitter on that one, and deciding the best course for you. The UK generally for homes is a long way behind, 30 to 40 years behind at least Germany, if not some of the rest of the main European continent. They've been using passive house and energy plus housing for the last 30 to 40 years. So energy plus housing is where the house produces more energy than it uses. So it's essentially a small power station. So you can transfer the electricity and whatnot back onto the grid for other people to use. And this is where we need to be heading. Currently, we're still using Victorian based technology. The recent retrofit Green's Homes Grant project isn't going fantastically well. That needs to be relooked at, and is, to my understanding, being relooked at. But we've got, I think, about 24 million homes or more across the country that need to be retrofitted to be more energy efficient. So there's quite a few things that you can do around your home. And if you're unsure some of the things you can do, you can check out your EPC or Energy Performance Certificate on the EPC register. So you can type in your address and you can see if it's there. If you don't have one, you don't necessarily need to get one done. The EPC is only really needed if you're selling a property or renting a property under law now. But if there isn't one there, I would just recommend doing a general Google search as well, or listening to me now on some of the things you can do. Obviously, owners of properties have more ability to do things with their property because they own it. But tenants, I'd recommend talking to your landlords. There is the minimum energy efficiency standards now, the MEES. So if your building on the EPC register is coming as F or below, so FG, it shouldn't be rented at the moment. It's or at least get you need updates done to it before the landlord will be able to rent it to you again or somebody else again. There's also a law in place where you can make demands of your landlord to do energy efficiency improvements as well. One of the things that we need to do overall, as I mentioned earlier, is reduce consumption across everything that we do. That is one of the key impacts that we can have. And to help reduce consumption, we sometimes need to meter it so we know how much we're using. It's free to get water meters. Again, if you're a tenant, please ask your landlord. But Severn Trent, for instance, will come and fit it for free. I do definitely recommend these if you've got 3 or less people in a household. If you've got more than 3, just think about maybe how much water you're using, but definitely useful to have, because then you only pay for the water you actually use. Smart meters are currently being rolled out, which gives you a better view over your gas and electricity, so you can understand what appliances are using how much energy and how much you're using overall. And it's also, if you can, get rid of your prepay meter. They are more expensive than normal meters, so you are paying more for your electricity and gas. So if you can, get rid of it. Moving on to building fabric, we've got insulation. This is one of the main bits that is normally recommended on a household. So if you've got cavity wall, get cavity wall insulation. Many buildings across the UK have solid wall. My property does, for instance. So you can get internal, external wall. I'd only really recommend internal. One, if you've got the space for it, because it does take a couple of inches off the inside of your room. But also two, if you're completely overhauling a room. Otherwise, it's a lot of work to do to refit everything back into the room. But this can save you 30%, sorry, 35% of your heat loss in your property. Also insulating your loft, and you can do this on the rafters, on the joists, but making sure the loft is insulated. And you certainly know houses that need loft insulation when it's a cold day, it maybe been snowing, and the snow's already melted. If that's the case, they've got the house too warm, kind of they've got the heating too warm, or they've not got enough insulation. And you're supposed to have about 300 millimeters of insulation, so a 30 centimeter ruler worth. You can also get underfloor insulation if you've got suspended floors, suspended timber floors. What they can do is take a slat up from either side of the floor, pass a net underneath, and fill it with insulation. You can also insulate bay windows. I've mentioned green roofs here as well. Again, this might be quite a task and probably want to do it with a new build, but green roofs do act an amount of insulation as well. And they actually were used only a couple of hundred years ago and more. To a degree, you could count a thatched roof as a green roof. But people a couple of hundred years ago and more knew the benefit of having green roofs. You can also add insulation to your water cylinder if you've got one, and also all of your hot water pipes as well to help keep them warm. It's also important to draft proof a house, so your doors, your windows, sometimes around things like your letterbox and your keyhole potentially, depending what sort of key you've got. This basically stops kind of small amount of drafts, because if you've got your window open just slightly, you can feel quite a lot of air coming through. So it's important to kind of reduce that down, because that will have a cooling effect on your rooms, which is also why I mentioned keeping internal doors closed and draft proofing, so you can get kind of snakes for the kind of snake rug things for the doors, just to stop the air from coming underneath the door. But don't forget that you do also need to ventilate the house occasionally, otherwise you will end up with damp and mold and condensation issues. You can install solar PV. I would fully recommend doing all these other things before doing solar PV. Unfortunately, the feed-in tariff no longer exists, but you can also rent your roof to various companies as well. But again, for that one, I would look at what your mortgage, if you've got a mortgage, what your mortgage provider says about that, and also your insurance policy potentially as well. We've also got the renewable heat incentive, which is a bit like the feed-in tariff, but for heat. So the government, if you've installed solar thermal panels to help heat water, air source heat pumps or ground source heat pumps, will give you a certain amount of money for making use of those. We've also got water harvesting, again a bit harder, especially if you're trying to retrofit this in. But you've got rainwater harvesting, and you can use things like water butts and things to collect water for your allotments. But you can also use rainwater within a building as well. Grey water harvesting is water from, say, your sinks or your baths. Some people have actually connected up the bottom of their sinks to the top of their of their cisterns, so the sink actually fills the cistern in their toilets. So they're not using extra kind of new clean drinkable water for the toilet as well. And then there's also black water, which is essentially sewage. And I'm aware that some people have retrofitted buildings so that they can reuse the water that's kind of come through the sewage system. But again, a difficult one to retrofit, but something that we all need to kind of be thinking about. We need to make more use of reuse and recycle materials when renovating. So I've seen a big shift, and I think there was an event this week for Green Week around upcycling furniture, and we need to do more of this and reusing furniture where we can instead of just buying new. Um, think about things like I mentioned green roofs earlier. You can also actually just paint your roof green or white. Um, this basically increases the reflectivity of the roof, and actually if we all did this across a city or a town or even a village, it would actually change the temperature of the local area because more heat would be reflected away from us. It's essentially how a glacier works, um, or an ice cap, and it's actually what they're doing in Nepal. They're going around painting the rocks there to reduce the speed that the glaciers in the local area are melting away. We can also look to install triple glazing, which is on the most part now cost similar to double glazing. So the thermal properties of that is essentially the same as touching a wall. Obviously, if you touch glass, even double glazed, it's still kind of cold. But with triple glazing, it's basically like just touching another wall. We've also got smart glass as well, which there's a couple of sorts, but essentially it means that it has a it has a certain amount of insulation property depending on summer or winter. So in the summer, it'll let the light through, but not the extra heat. So fantastic for things like conservatories, but we can use them in our general windows as well. And then we can also reduce water generally. It's what called the forgotten utility because a lot of people don't think about it. But with these, we can install restrictors in our showers, in our taps. We can install, I've called them hippos or bricks, is what they tend to be called. So you can just put a brick in the cistern, for instance, and it'll take up more water if you've got an older cistern and reduce the amount of flush. But hippos are essentially plastic bags with beads that expand and do the same thing. Um, you also got low flush toilets as well, or dual flush toilets. Low flush toilets are just kind of smaller cisterns, so they hold less water. Um, we must remember that actually saving water not only saves the water for other people, but it also saves the energy used to clean that water and the CO2 emitted from cleaning that water as well. Couple of websites to use. So WaterWise is great for extra advice on water saving, and Save Water, Save Money is great for some freebies and things from your local water provider. So you can reduce how much water, or you can find leaks and various other things. Two very good websites there. We can also think about streaming less. So thinking about our data. So things like Netflix, YouTube, Disney, they all use a lot of energy to stream. I believe a one episode of a program is equivalent to a light bulb being on for a year, if I remember rightly. So it can be quite a lot of energy for just one episode. Also, don't with your phones, don't use your phone data. Use Wi-Fi. It uses the phone's battery faster, but also the the cloud servers that the phones use more data as well. There's a kind of knock-on effect there. And linked to that is downloading data overnight. So if you're wanting to watch a show the next day, and you can download it, say on Netflix, then download it overnight and then watch it during the day, because overnight and this is this bottom point about thinking when you're using electricity and making use of timers. During the period of 4 to 7 p.m. most evenings is the period where a lot of people are using energy, and the period where we're more likely to be using fossil fuels, at least in the UK, and to be honest, many other countries as well. It's the point where everybody comes home, puts the kettle on, basically. So lots of energy and potential fossil fuel use. So we want to try and avoid that where possible. You can also watch TV together instead of watching it in different rooms on different devices or using energy. I mentioned board games on here as well. Board games are back. They are back in. They are cool again. There are all sorts of games, and I'm not just talking Cluedo, Monopoly. One of the actual biggest games, which I think is now beating Monopoly, is called Settlers of Catan, which is a fantastic game, and it's different every single time you play it. But there are loads of games out there, and we actually have one of the biggest board game conventions in the world that gets hosted in Birmingham each year, the UK Games Expo. So if you're not sure, fully recommend going along to to that event and finding out about all the things, all the games you can get involved with. Also thinking about eco appliances as well. So looking at how much energy your appliances use, and you can use, if you've got a smart meter, you can use it for that, to find out how much energy, but just think about the energy use of the appliances that you're buying in. Transport wise, you really need to think about the size of our cars. I do see people driving around, and I'm not accusing them of not having large family, but driving around in very large cars just by themselves. We really need to move to smaller cars generally. As you can see, it takes 6 tons of CO2 equivalent to build a Citroen C1, and 35 tons of CO2 for a Land Rover Discovery. So that's 3 years of a 10-ton living being used before it's even driven off the forecourt, which is a lot of emissions. And we need to think about the size of the cars we're using, and also think about the miles per gallon that they use up as well. We really need to move to more fuel efficient cars, and also think about how we're driving. So kind of maintaining the cars. So driving more fuel eco-friendly, fuel efficiently, and looking at the uptake, the upkeep of the car. So making sure that the tires are at the right PSI, making sure that we aren't driving down the motorway with our windows down, because that creates a lot of drag and reduces the miles per gallon of the vehicle. And also think about when you're getting your next car. Well, one thing is to use your current car for as long as possible. There's a certain amount of integrated kind of CO2 into the building of that car. So use that for as long as possible. But when you do buy a new car, look at things like hybrid and electric, and the next stage of the car industry, basically. We also need to fly less generally, and we've learned over the last 12 months that AV and audio visual, so things like Zoom, Teams, things like that, are fantastic, can be fantastic. I know that a lot of people are tired of them now, but hopefully as we go, as kind of lockdown around the world happens, gets released a little bit, we can go back to some in-person meetings, but also make more use of Zooms and Teams instead of driving and flying across the country when we only need a half an hour to an hour meeting. Also thinking about holidays as well. Do we really need to travel to other countries for a holiday, or can we just go to, in the UK, can we go to Scotland? Can we go to Wales? Can we just kind of go somewhere down the road even, and enjoy holidays there instead? Just get away a bit. So on to reducing waste. As I said, again, you might have got a kind of a deja vu about this now, but we need to reduce consumption. That is the best way to affect our carbon one of the best ways to affect our carbon emissions, our carbon footprint. We need to stop buying for the sake of just buying new. You get a new phone being released nearly every year, which is a different color or just slightly upgraded. When you've got a perfectly usable phone in your pocket, you don't need to be going out and buying a new mobile, or as I said, a new car. If it still works, use it to the biggest of its ability, and then recycle it. Don't just bin it. Make sure it goes to at least in the mobile instance, to a electronics goods recycler. It has everything has an invested carbon in it. We also need to start buying more items that are fixable. So Fairphone, for instance, is a modular system phone. You can take it apart. It only has a couple of screws in it, and you can literally just pull out the bits and put it. You can take it apart and put it together in about 5 minutes. Obviously, some of the phones are not designed very well to be taken apart and fixed. The EU is just implementing in the next couple of months, I believe, a right to fix law, which the UK, as part of the Brexit agreement, has agreed to bring over into our laws as well, which means that items such as washing machines, for instance, that one springs to mind because I tried to fix my washing machine a couple of years ago, will be fixable because it won't have a sealed drum anymore. Time for a little bit of Grinch time. I know I might get a little bit of hate for for this, but we do need to think about our holidays excess. So we've got various holidays throughout the year, and it's great to celebrate these events, but we also need to think about the impact that they do have. So Christmas uses between 280 kilograms to 1,500 grams of CO2 equivalent per adult, which is a lot. Unwanted presents, the average adult spends between 440 to £1,000 on presents, of which 20%, so forgive the pounds, 20% are normally unwanted, researchers found. We also waste about a third of the food, and generally, globally, daily, we waste about a third of the food. We've also got avoidable transport, people driving, flying when they could potentially just have a Skype meeting or Zoom or Teams, which I know at the moment seems like a really bad proposition, but in the future, when hopefully COVID is behind us, we can start to think about that a little bit. Also, fairy lights use 45 kilowatt hours per year. More, I believe, if they've got the old style light bulbs in, so please move to LED if you can. Cards, the average adult posts 20 Christmas cards, and actually the most part of the footprint for those cards isn't the trees and that sort of side of it and the paper, it's actually in the delivery of those cards to the other person. We also need to think about costumes. So this is for Christmas, Halloween, all sorts. A lot of costumes get bought, used, and then thrown away instead of donated or reused for next year. I also learned yesterday that roses, so Valentine's Day in this case, if you're buying them, if you've grown them in your house, in your garden, then great, cut it off. That's zero impact. But if you're getting them from greenhouses in Netherlands, it's 2.1 kilogram per rose. One of my pet peeves is balloons and the use of helium. So helium is actually a really rare element. It's used for research, it's used for medical purposes like in MRI scanners and things like that. It's actually really expensive to mine from the atmosphere, and we basically just use it for fun. We really need to think about whether we need helium, and also especially whether we need balloons, because they are just made of plastic, and they create plastic waste, especially if they pop. Releasing them into the atmosphere is even worse. So we need to think about that, and we need to think about making parties more sustainable generally. So thinking about the plates that we use, thinking about whether we need to give party bags, and if we do, what goes in them, and things like that. So just basically thinking about the processes that we go through in life, and not just doing it because it's the normal thing. We need to shift what we see as normal. This also includes things like fast fashion. We really need to tackle the fast fashion industry. Move organic clothing is good. Obviously, a lot of clothing is made of plastics and textiles, which the when you put it through the washing machine, those fabrics will go into the water and get into watercourses, into our fish. And we've already found plastics from our food chain in humans. But we really need to look at the fast fashion industry and really reduce how much clothing we're buying. And we need to move overall, as I mentioned the other day, to a circular economy. So this is the idea that we only put a certain amount of materials into the system, and we use those up as much as possible. We share them, we borrow them, we maintain and prolong them. We demanufacture and remanufacture, recycle. We use anaerobic digestion and biogas. Basically, that we go through the prevent, reduce, reuse, and recycle, but we don't get as far down as the disposal and landfill within the waste hierarchy. And this is going to need a massive systems change. This is everything from the design of products in the first place all the way through the process. So some other home tips. One of the biggest impacts you can have is changing your diet to a more plant-based diet. Not talking about vegan or vegetarian necessarily, but just at least reducing your food intake. It has there's data that shows that there is a reduced mortality by 6 to 10% worldwide if we reduce meat intake. There's also shifting to a more plant-based diet is actually worth 13% of GDP worldwide by 2050, and that's without even taking into account the potential impacts of climate change. So it's a good thing to do even without climate change being a factor. We also need to think more about where our food's coming from, so buying locally and seasonally. Looking at our labeling and seeing where the food is coming from. If it's coming from the UK, then great. If it's coming from another country, then you really need to think, is this actually seasonal? How far has it traveled? Has it come by plane, by boat? The food miles are really important. You also, with the labeling as well, got the difference between things like best before and use by dates and sell by and things like that. So we can ignore sell by and display by. Best before is that it's just best before. It doesn't necessarily mean it's unedible afterwards. We just need to use our eyes and nose and common sense. And then use by is the important one. The exception to the rule with best before is eggs, though. If it says best before, eat the eggs before. We can also look at our labeling with regards to things like MSC, so if that's for the fish, if it's organic, fair trade, Rainforest Alliance, but be careful of people labeling things without officially recognized labels on. There's a lot of labels out there now which will say certain things or try and get you to believe certain things, and are very easily to misinterpret. We can also do things like, as I said, buy locally, buy beer in local pubs and breweries. If you buy a bottle, an international bottle from a shop, it has actually a much higher CO2 emission than something from a local brewery. And I do have the stats to hand ish right now, if anybody has any questions about that later. And we can also make it vegan as well. So the reason it doesn't tend to be vegan is due to the isinglass, so fish bladder used to filter it out. But you do also get things like milk and oysters used in some beers as well. Toilet rolls. Moving to toilet rolls without bleach in them. Toilet rolls aren't white normally, but they're bleached that color. So can we switch to toilet rolls that are actually far healthier for the planet and maybe use recycled paper instead of virgin? A bidet is a great option for if you don't want to go toilet rolls. Um, I have also seen on various Facebook pages people moving to basically reusable toilet roll where they wash it and reuse it. And then also maintaining things like fridges and freezers. So making you defrost your freezer. I actually found out the other day that you can get LED lights for your fridge. And in fact, LEDs really like being cool. So actually, fridge is a really good place for them to be installed. You can get wild, so grow your own and build an allotment, build bug hotels, hedgehog shelters, um, making sure you use FSC paper, so that's the Forest Stewardship Commission. Planting trees. We really need to stop cutting down trees. Trees are literally our best friends, especially the old ones. They are our best technology for reducing the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. We can try guerrilla gardening or seed bombs. So this sounds like a little bit of warfare, but guerrilla gardening is essentially going and planting seeds and plants in just anywhere, basically, not necessarily in your own garden. And seed bombs are really easy to make. Permaculture is the idea of working with the land, with your garden, with nature, to grow fruits, vegetables, and other things in your garden. Humans naturally have a level, well, biophilic. Basically, that means we need to be connected to nature. If you remove us from nature too much or altogether, it does affect our mental health and well-being. And that, along with seeing everything that's been happening with the climate, causes eco-anxiety, which panic is basically a panic people get just thinking about the environment. We've also got ecophobia as well, which is it basically paralyzes people from being able to act on things. So hopefully some of these ideas will have helped. If anybody's moving towards that, move away from that and have some actions that they can do. Talking about businesses, we can look at green jobs. Are you interested in sustainability? Could you go into sustainable career? Or can within your roles you be thinking more about sustainability in your day-to-day and the processes that are done? We need to support social businesses. So these are businesses where they put most, if not all, the profits that they make back into society and making a positive change. Making changes to events that we do for businesses. So there's an ISO 2012-1 which looks at this. You don't have to be accredited to it, but it's got some fantastic ideas of actually how you can make your event more sustainable. And then, as I said, you can think about what you can do at work. So things like paper printing, making suggestions, changing systems, setting up a green champion group or something similar to that. So where you get a number of people working together, create an action plan for how your department can reduce its emissions. Overall, it's fantastic to do for the environment, but it does generally tend to save the business money as well. And you should always be asking why. Why are we doing things in this way? It could be because there's been a system put in 10 years ago and nobody's thought to ask why it's still there. And there's a much more efficient system that you can put in place now. And then you need to ask, what can your work do? So changing their energy supplier, changing their systems, installing renewables, look at their logistics. As I mentioned, scope 1, 2, and 3. So measure that and take action on it. Look at what they can do socially in the community, and look at how they can maybe link it with research, and potentially ask for help and support from other businesses and universities, and government groups and things like that. If you're studying, you can do dissertation and projects on sustainability, and actually link up with external businesses to do that. You can go digital, get rid of paper altogether. This is for studying and work. So you can potentially get just rid of PowerPoints as a handout. Make sure you ask your lecturer and kind of put the pressure on there. Emails do have a CO2 footprint, and in fact, Reply All has a massive CO2 footprint. So really think about what emails you're sending. Do you really need to send an email just to say thank you? I know it's polite, but could you send that in another email with some other stuff in it at the same time, for instance? And also an e-portfolio as well. So are all your certificates for your CPD or your achievements and things printed out in a folder, or can you put them on something like Pebble-Pad so you can easily send them to employers? We need to vote as much as possible. We need to get as many people out voting as possible. We need them to elect people who are actually going to take a stance on this and do as much as they can to tackle climate change now. Being an activist doing activism doesn't mean that you have to be arrested. It doesn't mean that you have to be what many people have in their heads as 60s eco hippies. It's just taking action to make a change. It could be going on a demo, it could be going to something like COP26, but it could just be doing something within your own local area, and I'll come on to some groups in a moment. It could be something as simple as leaving the plastic in the shop instead of taking it home with you to make a kind of form of protest to the shop owners. We also need to support education, especially of women, and get over taboos. So talk about periods and other taboos that are in our society, so that we can all talk about things more and break down some of the barriers that people have, that will allow them to move towards a more sustainable future. So these are some of the local groups. As you can see, quite a few to get involved with, anything from collecting litter to working with policy to trying to get rid of fossil free and divestment groups, all sorts. So some of the big questions are where I'm running out of time here, and I'm going to put a trigger warning here because I'm aware that the next two especially are maybe a bit triggering for people. Some of the big questions that people ask themselves, and again, these might not be related to you. This is completely your own decision. Everybody's going to have a completely different view on this. I am just putting them out there so you can think about it. But one is pets and pet ownership. So it's been some data suggests that pet ownership, especially of say a dog, creates a larger carbon footprint in a year than driving an SUV. You've got the cost of resources of upkeep. So that includes things like waste, so things like poo bags, plastic bottles, the meat for the food, and also the fact, say, with cats with the local ecosystem, for instance. The Wildlife Trust recommends people adopt where they can instead of going to breeders. And they've got a fantastic website of how to be eco-friendly pet owner, which you can go to there. Another one is having a child. So a child is approximately 373 tons of CO2 over a lifetime of 78 years, based on a carbon reduction each year of about, I think it's 3.9%. each year based on targets of 80% by 2050. I'm not saying you shouldn't have a child or whatever, but it's something that we need to think about. Apparently 40%, approximately 40% of all pregnancies globally are unintended. We need to think about the resources, and also when we come to kids as well. Obviously, there's lots of things that we can buy for them, and that they will use and things. But one of the other things related to waste is things like reusable nappies. So ditching the nappy waste that we're putting into landfills at the moment and moving to reusables. And finally on this is, death. It's one thing that many of us will try not to think about, but it's the question around cremation, burial, which one's got the greener footprint maybe. Cemeteries actually have quite a large upkeep. So I read something actually yesterday that was suggesting that cremation is better than cemetery burial. However, you can do natural burials now. So be buried in, say, a wicker basket or even a cloth under a tree and have a natural decomposition in certain burial sites at the moment. So I fully recommend looking into that. And also think about your will again. Where is maybe your money going, or who's your property going to, and things like that. So think about what you're doing with your will. At the last resort, when all other options have been completely exhausted, do we think about carbon offsetting? That is the very last thing that we need to think about. And this is basically where you're spending money into a program so that they can help you to zero out emissions that you've caused, essentially. Just going to remind people that this has been part of Green Week. So a couple of links there for the other events that are happening later today, tomorrow, and Sunday. So please do go and sign up for those. And thank you, and over to you. Are there any questions at all?
Hi, David.
Hi, Janet.
Hi. I'm just wondering, where did you get the information about the good and bad banks from? Your list of good banks and bad banks.
The ethical, I think it was the ethicalconsumer.org, if I remember rightly.
Right, okay. It's just that a while ago I changed from First Direct to Nationwide.
Yeah.
And it was a very smooth process, so I could recommend the process to anybody. But Nationwide was highly recommended on the ethical consumer list, according to somebody who told me about it. So
Okay.
I mean, the list must change, mustn't it?
Yes. Yeah. I was trying to find, as I said last night, the most up-to-date list. But it also depends on exactly which website you look at and what parameters they have for ethical.
Yes.
As well. So
Yeah.
that's a factor as well.
Okay, thanks.
Are there any other questions? Feel free to either unmute yourself or put it in the chat box. So we've had a question, does Warwick have a green team for staff where we might get involved in these initiatives? So yes, we have green champions, the green champion networks. Many of these green champion networks have set up green action teams as well. So if you go to the website that you can see in front of you now, so warwick.ac.uk/environment, under get involved, you can sign up to be a green champion, and we can link you up with a green team in your local department if there is one, or we can help you set one up.
Hi David, it's Claire here.
Hi Claire.
Hi, amazing content once again. You've got so much in there. I'm caught between thinking I'm going to do that, I need to do that, and thinking, oh my God, I'm still not doing enough. But that's a good feeling because you've opened my eyes to some more things. I know you've been recording some of these sessions. Where can we get hold of them? And are you happy for us to share your content?
Yep, so I will be putting these on YouTube. The Sustainability 101 is already on YouTube. If you search for Coventry and Warwickshire Green Week, it will come up, or I will also attempt to drop a link into the chat.
Perfect.
And many of the events this week have been recorded. So I will, yeah, so they will be on that channel in the not too distant future.
Thank you very much.
Okay. If there's no other questions, I think we'll wrap up there. As I said, I'll just drop this channel into the chat box now. And thank you everyone for coming along to the talk, and I hope it was useful and informative. And I'm sure many of you have some ecosering to go and do.